Well, hello, and hope you're doing well on this 4th of July weekend. My name is Aaron. If we haven't met, I'm one of the teaching pastors here, and I'm just so grateful for this opportunity to open the scriptures with you as we continue this series, The Way of the Wise. And I want to begin today with a story about one of my kids. So my wife, Katie, and I, we have 5 kids, and this story is about the week that one of them began kindergarten. So this is kind of a big thing in the life of a child, going to full-time school for the first time. And so I was spending a little extra time with this particular kid, and after school one day, we were playing a video game together. It's like a Lego game. Maybe you've seen these. And so here we are, side by side, controllers in hand, and suddenly, my sweet, innocent little 5-year-old child says to me, "Dad, this level is a real potty word." And I was like, what? Where did that come from? Because I'm thinking, I don't talk like that. And I know my wife doesn't talk like that. It was those kindergartners. And so that's when we decided to homeschool our kids. Just kidding. Our kids still go to public school. It's great. The teachers, the principal, everybody is fantastic. But it was just one of these moments. It's like, where did that come from? And I wonder if you've had a moment like that. Not with your kids, but with you. Or something popped into your head, something came flying out of your mouth. It just made you go, okay, where did that come from? You're at a social gathering, a party, and you don't really know everybody there. It's kind of uncomfortable. It feels a little bit like that middle school cafeteria deal back in the day. And so you're trying to make connections, but you feel weird. And so you end up telling this off-color joke. And it's like immediately after the party, you're like, where did that even come from? Or, somebody at work that you don't really get along with that well. It's not your favorite person, and you find out that something kind of bad has happened to them. And the first thought that comes into your mind is a happy thought. And you think to yourself, what kind of evil person am I? Where did that come from? You're driving to work, somebody cuts you off, and a word just flies out of your mouth, or maybe worse yet, your hand. One particular digit on your hand just flies into motion, sort of like all on its own. And afterwards, you're like, where did that come from? What are you doing? And so we have these moments, and they're not always bad. Maybe you can relate to a situation. You're sitting at a table with a good friend that you care about very much, and they're going through a really difficult season. And you just want so badly to encourage them, to lift their spirits. And so you go for it, and you begin to speak, and what comes out of your mouth is just, is so right and timely and kind and even beautiful. And you look at your friend and it just tears are streaming out of their eyes, and it's just like, thank you so much for saying that. And in moments like that, you just go, where did that come from? Sometimes it's really ugly and sometimes it's really good. But to answer this question, I think we can find the answer in the book of Proverbs. And this is where we've been spending our time in this series, The Way of the Wise. And a major theme in the book of Proverbs is the heart. Our hearts. And by that, I don't mean like that organ that's thumping in your chest. No, for the ancient Hebrew mindset, and of course the ancient Hebrews, they're the ones who wrote the book of Proverbs, the heart is not an organ. It's not even just your feelings. It's like everything in your inner self. Your feeling, your thinking, your motivations, that whole part of you that's not physical. It's a major theme in the book of Proverbs. In fact, one proverb from chapter 27, let's check this out, puts it this way. As water reflects the face, so one's life reflects the heart. And it just reminds me of some moments I've had, waking up on a lake, vacation or whatever, and it's so still that the water perfectly reflects the trees, the sky, sunrise, and it's hard to tell where the sky stops and the water begins. And the idea here is our lives perfectly reflect what's going on in our hearts. And so this question, where did that come from? I mean, whether it's something really good or something really bad, the answer according to the book of Proverbs, is this. It comes from your heart. Because everything that you think and say and do, it's all reflective of what's going on in your heart. In fact, as we will discover, the heart is the source of everything in our lives. One preacher put it in a really great way, I think. He said, if it's in there, it's going to come out of there. If it's in your heart, just buckle up because it's going to come out in your life. And so I just want to talk today about our hearts. And so a question for you is, how's your heart? How's your heart? I mean, what's going on in there? And I think this is a really important question because your life is being shaped by your heart. I mean, eventually, what's going on in your heart, it's going to impact your relationships. It's going to influence how you talk to your kids, how you relate to your spouse. Your heart is going to have something to say about how you work and how you relate to those who you work with. Your heart shapes your life. And so can we talk about this? And if you want to know where we're headed today, it's going to be 2 practices that lead to a healthy heart. And we're going to be spending our time in Proverbs chapter 4. And so if you have a Bible with you, I invite you to follow along. But of course, we'll be putting words up on the screen as well. And so let's jump into Proverbs chapter 4 in this first practice that leads to a healthy heart. We're going to begin in verse 20. My son, pay attention to what I say. Immediately, we're introduced to a relationship between a father and a son. And what's going on here is that wise King Solomon is speaking to his sons, the princes of the kingdom of Israel. And if you've been following along with us, you might remember that this first section of the book of Proverbs, we've been calling it Lessons on Wisdom. And it's really Solomon trying to get the attention of his sons because they're going to run the nation one day, and he wants them to choose the path of wisdom. He wants them to get serious about pursuing wisdom. So he says, my son, pay attention. Hey, listen up to what I have to say. Turn your ear to my words. And so what does he have to say? Well, here we go. Verse 21. Do not let them, and he's speaking about his words of wisdom, this teaching of truth, that's not just his words, that's based on the character of God and the law of God as presented in the Old Testament. Do not let them out of your sight. Pay attention to them. Keep them within your hearts. Keep them in your heart. It's like, hey, take this wisdom and this truth, put it in your heart, and then lock it up in there so that it can't get out. That's how important this is. So the first practice that leads to a healthy heart, I'm calling it this right here. Invest in your heart. And what I mean by investing in your heart is regularly depositing wisdom and truth in your heart. That's what it means to invest in your heart. And why is this so important? Well, the very next verse, Solomon tells us. He says, for they, again speaking about these words of wisdom and God's truth, for they are life to those who find them, and they heal or health to one's whole body. These words, this wisdom, this truth of God that Solomon is presenting, he's like, this is going to lead you to life. If you embrace this, understand this is going to lead to the kind of life that you and I are after, that we really want, this full, rich, meaningful life. That's the goal. That's why we invest wisdom into our hearts. Now, this idea of investing in our hearts through depositing wisdom and truth, I mean, it's all over the book of Proverbs. And if you've been following along with us in the Wisdom Challenge, reading through the Proverbs together, you've probably bumped into this theme. And so as I show you this one particular proverb from chapter 6, it may look familiar. Bind them, again, wisdom and truth, bind them always on your heart and fasten them around your neck. Get these words into your heart and tie them up there so that they stick and so that they stay. Another proverb uses the language of write them on the tablet of your heart. And of course, in the ancient world, it wasn't, a pen and a paper. It was more like this. Chiseling words of wisdom into your heart. And this is how the ancient Hebrews recorded history and made contracts and recorded the scriptures by hammering and chiseling them into stone. So again, the idea, make them permanent in your heart by chiseling them in there. Now, if I'm Solomon's sons, I'm thinking, okay, Dad, got the idea, understand. Sounds like a lot of work. Sounds tedious. I don't know if you've ever tried to chisel something, but it's not as easy as just writing something down. And it's true, the idea of continually and regularly investing wisdom and learning it and make sure it gets in your heart and stays there, that sounds like hard work, right? So a question you might be asking, a question the boys probably were asking is this really worth it? And to answer that question, now I want to show you something that Jesus said about the heart. And here's the thing, Jesus actually had a lot to say about our hearts and about wisdom. In fact, the next series we're going to jump into after this one, just a couple weeks, is about the wisdom of Jesus and some of the themes that we find in the book of Proverbs and how they find their way in the life and the teaching of Jesus. But let's take a look at Luke, the Gospel of Luke, something Jesus had to say about the heart. He says this, "A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart." Jesus is using this imagery of like a storehouse or a treasury, and he's saying, look, if you put good things in, if you invest good things, what are you gonna get out of that? You're gonna get good things out of it. What you put in is what you get out. And the reverse is true also, according to Jesus. "And an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart." Look, you keep putting bad stuff in, you put garbage in, you're gonna get garbage out. And Jesus summarizes this with this: "For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of." Again, your life is a reflection of your heart. And everything that you think, say, and do, where does it come from? It comes from your heart. And so if we take this teaching of Jesus seriously, the idea is this: if you invest good things, if you invest God's wisdom and truth into your heart in time, so maybe not tomorrow, possibly not next week, but in time, if you continue to do this, you will begin to see the evidence of wisdom and truth in your life. If you invest wisdom over time, wisdom will begin to be sprinkled into your words. If you invest wisdom into your heart, wisdom will begin to color your thinking. And if you continue to invest wisdom into your heart, in time you will find that your decisions are more and more shaped by wisdom. And so this is the principle. What you put in is what you get out. Put wisdom in, and you're gonna get wisdom out in your life. And so if you're like me, you're going, okay, understand, Solomon, I get it. How exactly do we invest wisdom into our hearts? Now, confession, I am not an expert on investing. In fact, you might say I'm not a consistent investor. At least that was true when I was younger, until I discovered something called auto deposit. Have you experienced this? So here's how it works with my bank. When my paycheck hits my checking account, automatically there is a transfer, certain amount that goes to my savings and a certain amount that's given to my church. Auto deposit, it's like automatic investing. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to plan it. I don't have to remember it. It just happens, and it's brilliant. And what I'm suggesting to you is this idea of investing wisdom into our hearts. It's really challenging without a good auto deposit system. But here's the good news. We have one. We have an auto deposit system, and it's called the row, the circle, and the chair. And this is our church's strategy for investing wisdom into our hearts. And so here it is, the row, the circle, and the chair. And if you've been around here at Ada Bible Church for a while, this probably is not new to you. But if this is, if you're newer to Ada Bible Church, this might be really helpful. So let me kind of just briefly walk through how this works. The row is what we're experiencing right now. It's when we gather together in person or digitally like we are now for a weekly investment of wisdom as we worship together, as we open the scriptures together. Simply by engaging in the row on a regular basis, it's like enrolling in a wisdom auto deposit program. And the circle, what's the circle? The circle is our word for small groups. It's like a group of 5, 8, 10 people that make a decision to journey together for a season of life for the purpose of encouraging and supporting each other as we all attempt to follow Jesus. For me, my circle looks like a group of 5 guys. We meet up for breakfast, and it's mostly challenging conversation around accountability. For others, their circle looks like sermon discussion. I mean, there's different types, different ages, couples, I mean, all kinds. But the general idea is if you decide to become part of a circle, part of a small group, you are like enrolling in a wisdom auto deposit program. Because inevitably, the conversations that happen in that circle, wisdom and encouragement and challenge are shared back and forth between each other as we attempt to help each other grow in our relationships with Jesus. And so simply by becoming part of a circle, you're kind of joining in on the wisdom auto deposit program. Now, the chair is that personal time with God. Through prayer, through scripture reading. You know, for me right now, this looks like my prayer journal and the wisdom challenge, reading a chapter of Proverbs, writing one down, and then sharing it with some friends. For many others, it looks like the Beyond the Weekend resource, which is a devotional that our staff writes that sort of extends the sermon out into the week, Monday through Friday. It's really, really great. But it's this time where you are just focusing on God's word and prayer. And if you simply opt into this, it's like you're enrolling in a wisdom auto deposit program. Now, if you want to join in on the Beyond the Weekend, here's how you would access it. You can have it sent right to your inbox. It's great. But again, my point with all this is that the row, the circle, and the chair, this is our church's strategy. It's our auto deposit program. So a question for you. What's your plan? As we talk about investing wisdom into our hearts, what's your plan for that? How do you plan to accomplish that? And maybe now is a great time to commit to the row, the circle, and the chair. Or maybe recommit to engaging in those environments. Because again, Jesus said, look, a good person brings up good things out of the good that they've stored in their hearts. If you put in good things, wisdom and truth, eventually you're going to see that wisdom and truth in your thoughts and in your words and in your actions. And this principle applies to the good things we put in our lives, but it also applies in reverse when we fill our hearts with pollution and garbage and stuff that's harmful and contrary to the way of Jesus. And so let's turn our attention now to the second practice that leads to a healthy heart. And let's jump back into Proverbs chapter 4, looking now at verse 23. Solomon says, above all else, listen, if you miss everything else that I say, don't miss this. This is most important. Above all else, guard your heart. Protect it. Defend it. I've heard it described as place a watchman over your heart. Why? Why is it so important? Here we go. For everything you do flows from it. Here it is again, all throughout Proverbs and really all throughout Scripture. Everything we do in life flows from our hearts, our thinking, our words, our actions, all of it comes from our hearts. And so guard it. Second practice that leads to a healthy heart is to guard your hearts. Now, this idea of protecting what matters, I think we're really good at this. I think we get this because I would argue that we live in probably the most overprotective culture on planet Earth, the history of planet Earth. I mean, we lock our doors. We wear bike helmets. We have seat belts. We put our kids in rear-facing car seats. And never mind the fact that when I was younger, and if you're older, you were younger, our parents just like double buckled us and kind of threw us in the back seat. Sometimes we were on the floor or the back window. I mean, clearly kids today are cared for more, but that's all right, I'm not bitter. But we live in this culture that is so overprotective. I mean, we put passwords and facial recognition on our cell phones and computers. And we put cases on those cell phones, and we put screen protectors on those cell phones. We insure those cell phones, and then we put these weird blue glasses on our faces to protect our eyes from the light from those cell phones. We know how to protect what matters to us, and we're really good about being intentional about it, except for the one thing in our lives that is the source of everything that we think, say, and do, our hearts. I think most of us are living our lives without giving much thought at all to how we're protecting our hearts. And Solomon would say, listen, above all else, I mean, more important than anything, you've got to guard your heart because everything you do flows from it. Okay, again, Solomon, you have our attention. So how do we do this? How do we guard our hearts? Because I was sort of thinking that guard your heart meant that during that dating phase of your life, like don't fall in love too fast. But I don't think that's what Solomon means. What does it look like to place a guard over our hearts? Well, I think it has everything to do with protecting the inputs of our hearts. If our hearts shape our lives, it's all about protecting what gets into our hearts. And so how do things get into our hearts? Well, I would argue it's these three inputs: our ears, our eyes, and our mind. And I'm not just making this up, but you can find these three ideas in this chapter of Proverbs, chapter 4. In fact, check this out. We've already looked at this proverb, but Solomon says, "My son, pay attention to what I say. Turn your ear to my words." And he's literally saying, bend your ear toward wisdom. And all throughout this section of Proverbs, it's like, listen to me. My son, listen. My son, pay attention. It's like, listen, listen, listen over and over again, because Solomon knows that the ear is a pathway to the heart. And what you listen to shapes your heart, and your heart shapes your life. And so question, what are you listening to? Is important. What are you listening to? Podcasts, radio, social media, cynical, bitter, angry voices, the tone which can be summarized by, we're right, everybody else is an idiot. What are you listening to? Music. Music that has lyrics that what your mama don't like. Lyrics that are hateful. Impure, racist. What are you listening to? And maybe it's not what, but maybe it's who. And the influence of your friends, and how we've talked throughout this series that our friends, they direct our lives. And so what are you listening to? And I just imagine some of you are going, dude, you sound like my grandmother right now. I mean, come on. Well, I mean, Solomon says, listen, what you hear shapes your heart, and your heart shapes your life. If you put in garbage, eventually what you're going to get out is garbage. And so what are you listening to? A second input is our eyes. In chapter 4, near the end, Solomon brings this up. He says, let your eyes look straight ahead, fix your gaze directly before you. He's like, focus on what you need to focus on. Look at what you should look at. Don't look at what you shouldn't look at. And again, our eyes shape our hearts, and our hearts shape our lives. And so, what are you looking at? What are you looking at? And maybe you're looking at stuff that's not yours, that you wish was yours, that belongs to somebody else. A lot of time on Amazon or Zillow, or looking at something in your neighbor's garage. And I just believe that over time, focusing our eyes in that way will lead to a heart of envy and deep dissatisfaction with the gifts that God has given us. What are you looking at? And can we talk about shows that we watch on Netflix or Hulu or whatever, movies, particular websites that are, we shouldn't be looking at them. And you might be thinking, look, it doesn't affect me. And everybody's doing this, and so, come on. But Jesus said, look, an evil person, they bring out evil things out of the evil that they put in their hearts. And it's kind of like if you put garbage into your heart, eventually, over time, you will begin to see garbage in your life. This will affect your marriage. This will affect your relationships. This will affect your mental and emotional well-being. Our hearts are the source of everything. And so Solomon says, guard your heart. Guard those inputs, our ears, our eyes, and our minds, what we choose to think about. And we could look at about 100 Proverbs that talk about what we think about, because the central message of Proverbs is get wisdom. Choose wisdom. Become a wise person. That's the point of the whole book. And wisdom, at its core, is right thinking. It's not everything that wisdom means, but at the core, it's right thinking. And the idea is if you think about the right things, you will begin to see the right things in your life. And I so appreciate something that the Apostle Paul wrote about this idea of thinking. He wrote it in a letter to a church in Philippi, which is in northern Greece. And so let's take a look at this. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, and he's not done, he's just getting started, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Fix your thoughts, focus your mind on things that are pure and lovely and good and right. Why? Because what we think about shapes our hearts, and our hearts shape our lives. So Paul says, choose to think about what's good. But what do you do when half the things that fly into your mind you just know are not good, are not right, are not lovely? Well, I think we go back to that first practice of investing wisdom and investing truth in our hearts, because something I believe that's true that Pastor Jeff says all the time is that right movement pushes out bad movement. And so if you're struggling with your thoughts, it's not just, okay, I'm going to try harder not to think about bad things. No, you need a better input. You need to push out those bad thoughts with what is good and right, with wisdom and truth. And secondly, something else that the Apostle Paul said to another church in Greece, a little bit farther south in Corinth, is what we do when we encounter thoughts that run contrary to the teaching in the heart of Jesus. Here's what he says. We take captive every thought. We don't just accept our thoughts. We don't just accept our feelings. Well, I felt it, so it must be true. No, we take them captive to make it obedient to Christ. And the idea is when you encounter thoughts that run contrary to the heart of God, you don't just accept them, you force them to submit to the authority of Jesus. In a sense, you boot them out of your head. You take them captive and you make them submit. And so again, the idea, what we think about shapes our hearts, and our hearts shape our lives. Guard your hearts, your ears, your eyes, and your mind. It's so important because everything flows out of our hearts. Now, one final thought about this idea of pursuing a healthy heart, and it comes from the very end of this chapter of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 4. Check this out. Give careful thoughts to the paths for your feet, and be steadfast in all your ways. Be careful, be steadfast. And he keeps going. One more verse. Do not turn to the right or the left. Don't wander. Keep your foot from evil. And as I read these words, I just get this sense of intentionality and purpose and focus and taking responsibility for our lives, for our hearts. And I guess what I'm trying to say is this idea of a healthy heart, of investing wisdom and truth and guarding our hearts. Just understand it's not going to happen accidentally. Just understand you can't float through life and just magically arrive at a healthy heart. No, it takes discipline and it takes purpose, and you're gonna have to take responsibility for the health of your hearts. Steadfast, careful, don't wander. And so let me ask you two important questions as we wrap up. The first question is this: what do you need to change? Let's be intentional. Let's be purposeful. What do you need to change? And maybe you're thinking, well, based on today's teaching, about 40 things. Okay, no. One thing. Just one thing in the area of investing wisdom or truth or guarding your heart. What's one thing that you need to change? And then second question, who do you need to tell? Who in your life can you trust to encourage you, to challenge you, and to keep you accountable to that one thing that you need to change? Because understand, if we're gonna pursue a healthy heart, it's not gonna happen accidentally. We're not just gonna float into it. We need discipline and purpose and intentionality to get there. And so let's end where we began. This idea of where did that come from? You know, the thoughts that pop into our heads, words that come flying out of our mouths. And sometimes they're very ugly and disturbing. And it's like, where did that come from? And sometimes they're really good. And I just believe that the more that we invest wisdom and truth, and the more that we set up boundaries to guard our hearts, the more that we're gonna be surprised by the good. And so my hope for you is that more and more in the coming weeks, as we invest and as we guard, that you would experience just really beautiful things flying out of your mouth. Wisdom as you attempt to guide your kids and your grandkids. That you would experience just kind words, just right fitting words as you attempt to encourage the people around you. That you would experience wisdom as you process decisions in your mind and in your heart. And I just pray that you would be surprised by some really good and noble and wise things in your life. And you would just say, where did that come from? And understand that it came from your heart. And that you would experience this week the transforming work of Jesus in your heart as you choose to invest truth and wisdom and as you choose to guard your heart. Thanks so much for joining us this week. So look forward to opening the scriptures again together next weekend.